بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Since the beginning of the month of Ramadan, we've been discussing this topic of nifaq as it's omnipresent in the Quran. Nifaq is this quality of two-facedness, sometimes translated as hypocrisy, that is there in some of the hearts of some of the believers. And it's a quality that we need to understand so that we can understand our enemies exterior to ourselves and also understand the possibility of that two-facedness within ourselves, so we can stamp it out after recognizing it and make sure that it doesn't creep in and lead to worse kind of symptoms. We talked about Surat Al-Munafiqun for some time. We talked about Surat Al-Ma'un, and these are two surahs that discuss some of the historical aspects of nifaq that were happening in the Prophet's time, and also some of these traits that believers sometimes have that pull them away from Allah. As Muslims, they could have nifaq in their hearts. 2 days ago, we started a discussion on some of the verses in Surah At-Tawbah. So in Surah At-Tawbah, Allah addresses the Muslims talking about this Tabuk campaign, which was a military campaign that Rasulullah organized to march north to confront the Byzantines. In the end, it was not an actual battle. There was no confrontation with the enemy, but there are certain wisdoms that Rasulullah had, and because of which he organized this whole campaign. And so these verses highlight some of those goals and then some of the benefits that the Muslims got out of this whole campaign. Primarily, it gave a chance for Rasulullah to test his companions and to see and show that nifaq that was in the hearts of many of them. The verse I want to start today, and I think this one verse we'll have to continue in the coming lecture, is the following. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Afa Allahu ank lima adhinta lahum حتى يتبين لك الذين صدقوا وتعلم الكاذبين. The verse begins with a dua for forgiveness for Rasulullah. عفا الله عنك. May Allah forgive you. And then he asks a rhetorical question of Rasulullah, لما أذنت لهم? Why did you give them leave? Why did you give them permission? Let me translate the verse, then we'll talk about what he's giving permission for, what all this means. Why did you give them permission? And then maybe in parentheses or something like you shouldn't have. If you hadn't, then it would have become clear for you those who are truthful, and you would know those who are liars. The verse is quite a riddle. There are lots of unknowns, and it seems like you could translate it this way and that and add brackets and shift the meaning quite a bit. But there are three elements. One is Allah is giving a prayer for forgiveness for the Prophet. Second, he's reprimanding him. Why did you give them permission? And then third, he's saying that if you hadn't given them permission, then it would have been clear who is a truthful person and who is a liar. All right, so this verse has become kind of a battleground for so many different views amongst our mufassirin, both Sunni and Shi'i mufassirin, and then even amongst the Shia, amongst the Sunni, there's many different views about what the verse is talking about, what exactly this prayer for forgiveness could mean for the Prophet. Why is Allah reprimanding him? Does that mean he's fallible, that he committed a sin, he did something wrong, and now Allah's asking for forgiveness for him and he's reprimanding him? Or is there some other way to understand this that is in keeping with infallibility of the Prophet? And then what exactly is he giving permission for? that he's being scolded like this. So before we get into the verse, which inshallah we'll do more tomorrow, I want to lay the foundation for this whole idea of infallibility. There are many verses in the Quran. If you are a regular student of Quran, then you've come across many verses, I'm sure, that seem to hint at or indicate something like sin for the various prophets of Allah. Right? There are words that are ascribed to them like dhulm. Adam and Eve say, Rabbana dhalamna anfusana, we've wronged ourselves. There's ghiwaya, which is misguidance, which is attributed to them. There is ma'siyah, fa'asa Adamu rabbahu faghawa. Adam disobeyed his Lord and thereby went astray. With Musa alayhi salam, when he kills this Egyptian, he says, هَذَا مِنْ عَمَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ. This is an act of Satan. Right, so these kinds of verses, or Yunus alayhi salam, why did he get swallowed up by the whale? Allah tells Rasulullah, لا تكن كصاحب الحوت. Oh Muhammad, don't be like Yunus. Don't follow in his footsteps. Right, so these kinds of verses and many others, they create this challenge for us. What is this saying about the character of the prophets? We've kind of adopted this theology of infallibility of the prophets, and these kinds of verses seem to call that into question. And they're always troubling for the Shi'i as he reads these verses. How do I deal with this? It's not a new problem. It's been there from the beginning. One of our great scholars, you're familiar undoubtedly with Sharif al-Radi, the author of Nahj al-Balagha. His brother, Sharif al-Murtada, is actually had a much more important role. He was a great faqih and commentator of Quran. Had a much greater role in scholarship, but I think he's less known probably to the common Shia because we don't have any works of his translated into English. But he compiled a book, he wrote a book called Tanzihul Anbiya. This is back in the 5th century. Tanzihul Anbiya, the whole point of the book was to address all these verses. So he compiled all these verses together, and one by one he addressed them and defended the infallibility of the prophets in light of these verses that seem to question that or raise questions around that. So one thing that we have to try to struggle with is, what's the basis for our belief in infallibility? Then we have to understand and try to figure out what are these verses saying? And then a third question, which is also important, is why would Allah mention these kinds of things about the prophets? Right? So these are three different things we have to struggle with to get a firm foundation in this idea of infallibility, and then we can come to this verse from Surah At-Tawbah. The idea behind infallibility is actually a rational idea that we get even before we come to Quran. So there's some things that we require Allah's input before we can understand. The Sharia is like that. We can't know how to pray, how He wants us to do this and that until He tells us in Quran or through the Prophet. So that requires input from Him. But our knowledge of God Himself, for instance, we don't know that God exists because the Quran tells us that God exists. We have to first know God, at least that He is there, and know something about Him even before we have the impetus to come to the Quran to learn anything else from the Quran. Right? If we only believe in Allah because the Quran tells us that there is a God, then there would be circular logic there. I need to first know God through my fitrah, through external means, and then I realize that I need to know this God who's created me. And so then I look and I search in the world, where has He spoken to us? And I look into these different divine messages where prophets are claiming that here I have the word of God, and then I have to start to engage with those and figure out which one is the right one, and then see what it says. So infallibility is something like that. We have to, before I can even trust this Quran that this person Muhammad allegedly brought, I have to first come to terms with what kind of people does Allah send. So this idea of infallibility is that, think of the converse of it. If the Prophet was to be able to make mistakes, if he could incorrectly receive revelation, Allah tells him something and he misunderstands, for instance. Allah tells him something and then he forgets part of it. He tells him to do something, he doesn't do it. He tells him not to do something, he does it. If those kinds of things were possible for any given prophet, then what would that do for the whole system of guidance? At the end of the day, on the day of judgment, Allah wants to be able to bring us to justice. If He's going to hold us accountable and ask us on the day of judgment, why did you not follow this prophet I sent to you? If there is a fallible system, a flawed system where the prophet could make mistakes, then we would have a legitimate excuse to say, well, I didn't follow him because I wasn't sure whether what he said was really right or not. He told me to, for instance, go fight in this way and lay my life down. I wasn't sure if this was really the real deal, or maybe he made a mistake. Maybe he misunderstood something. Maybe tomorrow, after I've laid down my life and sacrificed my life, he'll say, oh, sorry, it was a mistake and this was a bad move and we should have done something different. Well, I lost my life in the process. So that kind of doubt was in my mind, and I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't follow him just yet. Maybe I should wait and see whether things play out in his favor or not. Or he made a mistake last week. You sent him something, he missed it, he forgot it, you had to correct him. So I wasn't sure this week when he told me something, whether it was the complete message, the right message, or I was waiting for some updates, just in case there's some corrections. Let me wait till the corrections come and then maybe I'll act on it. So if that was the system in play, then those excuses would be there for us on the Day of Judgment. Allah would not be able to be justified. Yes, He could be dhalim into it. He could say, well, even if it wasn't clear, even if you didn't know, even if He didn't convey the message fully, I'm still going to punish you for not following Him. But then Allah would be dhalim. Right? So the whole system falls apart then. Judgment would not be able to take place with a conclusive answer that you're guilty. Nobody would actually be guilty because everyone would have an excuse before Allah. And if Allah is going to carry on with punishment and punish people who didn't accept the prophets, then we have to accept that Allah is dhalim, that He's unjust. Right? So the idea of infallibility is tied to all of these. It's tied to judgment, for judgment to be just, for Allah Himself to be just in holding us accountable. It's necessary for the guidance that He gives us to be complete and perfect. The only variable should be my willingness to follow it or not follow it. The system itself has to be in place, perfect, delivered to me completely, with no errors, and only then can Allah hold me accountable. So part of that system, an integral part, maybe one of the cornerstones of that system is these people who are the vessels of that revelation, to receive it from Allah, to teach it to us, to demonstrate it to us. That whole system must be perfectly executed. And if it's not, then all of this other stuff ensues. So that's the reasoning behind the need for infallibility in these prophets. Right? It's a rational argument. It's not based on a verse, it's not based on a hadith, because think logically, if I'm coming in from outside the faith, I just believe in God, but I don't yet believe in Islam, I don't yet believe in Quran, this Muhammad, I don't yet believe in these particular things, I believe in God. Now I can't jump ahead and say, let me take a verse of Quran, that's proof that the Quran is true. That's proof that Muhammad is true. Who brought that book where's that book from? I haven't even established that book has anything good to say or it has any credibility or authority, because I'm not there yet. So I first need to establish that this person, Muhammad, is qualified and authorized to be that spokesperson between the God that I know and myself, before I can take one of his hadith or one of the ayat from his book and use it for any sort of guidance. Right? So that's the logical progression that we have to go through before we can finally come to his sunnah and his kitab and start benefiting from it. Right? So infallibility has to come before. Now, this logical argument only establishes that the Prophet should be perfect in these aspects that I've talked about, in the receiving and the disseminating of those religious teachings, those teachings from Allah. So this is about where our Sunni brethren will stop in their understanding of infallibility. They'll say that, fine, so far this all makes sense, so what does that mean? That means that the Prophet, when he's receiving revelation, he must not make any mistakes. Right? They'll agree with that. That means that when Allah tells him to do something, he has to do it. But they allow for the fact that he could make a mistake, but then Allah corrects him. As long as the end result is correct guidance, then they say that's sufficient. So they allow for the possibility that Rasulullah could make an error, even do something wrong, and then as long as Allah comes and scolds him and tells him, no, you did it wrong, and here's what you should have done. So if the end is good guidance that we get, then the system is still perfect. If we're just going to suffice with our logical reasoning, then we might have to give in to this. You can argue whether this last aspect is reasonable or not. The Shia scholars will say that even that kind of a system, if it's the case that the Prophet himself could make mistakes and do the wrong thing and then have to be corrected by God, this really lowers the bar quite a bit. And he's not really that outstanding of a role model if that's the way he is. Right? It's one thing to do the right thing first from the beginning. It's another thing to do the wrong thing and then have someone come and twist your ear and tell you, no, it was wrong, here's what you should have done. And then now I'm on the right path, but after committing a sin first, after doing something wrong first. That means that position of the Prophet is much less. He's more like you and me. The best of us is similar to this kind of conception of what the Prophet is then. So the Shia say that no, this is not sufficient. Why? So let me just add one more thing to this. So oftentimes when you're dealing with rational arguments, you have to settle for less. The rational argument only gets you so far. I'll give you the example of our rational arguments about the existence of God. Right, so we have solid arguments that help us to understand God's existence, that there is a creator, there must be a creator who has created all of this. And even some arguments will give us the information that there must be that creator who has created us must have a high level of knowledge, a high level of wisdom, a high level of power to have been able to create the system this whole cosmos that he's created. That's about the extent of logical arguments. That we have a creator who has a high level of knowledge, high level of wisdom, high level of power, period. Now where's that and where's al-Jawsh al-Kabir? Right, where's that and Allahu nuru samawati wal ard? Like those descriptions that we have in Quran, that we have in ahadith and du'as to describe Allah, they are much more colorful, complete, exalted, have so many different attributes. Those we don't get from a rational argument. The rational argument only gives you the bare bones of the structure of a God who has a few attributes. Right? So even another example is a court case. Right? If you're trying to argue something in court, oftentimes, it's very clear to the common mind that a person is guilty of 10 crimes. But what can you actually prove in court sometimes is only part of one crime, and the plaintiff will have to suffice with whatever they can prove, even though he might be guilty of so many other things. They say Al Capone, for instance, he was guilty of so many murders and so many different crimes, but the only thing they could catch him on and actually prove was tax evasion. So they settle for that and they put him away for that, when it's very clear to everyone, there's no doubt that he was guilty of so many other crimes. Right? So my point is that when you're trying to prove something through reason alone, the end result of that argument is sometimes very low. But once you establish that God exists, Once you establish that, yes, the Prophet is infallible, this book is actually from God, and now you open the book and you see what the Prophet teaches, now your knowledge actually increases. You use the logical argument just to get yourself in. So now you can access the knowledge of the Prophet, you can access what's in the Quran, and that takes you to infinite levels of understanding that are not accessible through reason alone. So the logical argument for infallibility only gets you to the point where the Prophet must correctly receive the message and correctly get the message across. It doesn't tell us that he's infallible in all aspects of life. That he couldn't make mistakes, for instance, in mundane affairs. Put too much salt in food, for instance. Be offering his prayers and forget, am I in my third rak'ah or fourth rak'ah? Those things are possible based on the rational argument. But you have to look at the teachings of the Prophet himself. How does he now describe himself? What is his station? How do the imams from his progeny, how do they describe him? What is his station? That gives us a sense of actually where he is in reality, whereas the rational argument only gets us a little bit of the way. Hopefully that's clear, and if it's not, then we can push forward in the Q&A at the end. All right, so that's the basis for the infallibility. Then we come to these verses in the Quran. I'm not going to go through all of them, of course. That's not possible in a short amount of time. Actually, let me jump to the third question. The third question, and then we'll come back to the second question. The third question is, why would Allah even put these kinds of verses in the Quran? If the prophets, all of them, are the most exalted of God's creatures, the most perfect of people, in such exalted positions. And why would Allah choose wordings that give people the opportunity to think that maybe the prophets committed sins? Couldn't Allah have chosen different words? Why did he have to use ghiwaya and dhulm and dalal and shaitan and dhanb and ma'siyah? These are all words that we only know as sin, as evil, as bad. And this is his vocabulary. He's infinite in power. He's certainly infinite in his linguistic skills. He could choose other words that are, more tactful to avoid that implication, that hint, so then we don't end up with this kind of challenge. So one hint to the answer to that is in a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. He tells us that Allah chose words like this and described these particular things. Why? Because he didn't want a repeat of what happened in previous ummahs. Right, the Christians, for instance, because they saw Isa in his reality, they saw how amazing he was, what kind of miracles he did, raising the dead and curing the congenitally blind and the lepers and doing things that only God could do. They fell into this idea of deifying Christ and thinking that he himself is God. And here and there, we have, the Quran talks about the Jews, or some sect of Jews anyway, deifying Uzair as Ibnullah. Right? So that was a pitfall that past communities fell into because their prophets were so amazing. They started to think that this must be God himself. And so that's the reason why Allah wanted to use this kind of vocabulary to keep us grounded, to keep us away from that we struggle with these verses, struggle with these things. We have the rational argument. He trusted that our minds would guide us to infallibility, and then the Prophet, the Imams themselves, would guide us to understanding their actual station. But in the book, in the text, he kept these kinds of words, or he put these kinds of words to prevent us from being able to deify any of those prophets. That's one part of the answer. Another part of the answer is that Allah purposefully places these tests. He could make things, he says this repeatedly, if he wanted, he could make everyone believe. Right? He could do that, but that wouldn't serve his purpose. He doesn't want to make everyone believe by force. And he also apparently, as we see, he doesn't want to make truth so crystal clear in every aspect and at every level that it's obvious to everyone. The main aspects are very obvious, and then as you get deeper and deeper, things become a little bit more obscure. And you have to work a little bit before you can get to the truth. Once you work a little bit, then it becomes crystal clear. But it takes some work. It's not that everything's right there on the surface and anyone who sees it says absolutely all of this is true. Right? The main idea is God's existence, judgment, prophecy, text, resurrection. These kinds of things are clear. But as soon as you get past the surface and try to understand more details, then you have to now struggle. And that's part of his goal. He wants us to be, to use this intellect he's given us and struggle with the text, struggle with these teachings, find things that at first kind of are jarring and kind of seem contradictory, and then to have to struggle with them and see that, oh, now I see why he's saying this and this. It seemed like it was contradictory, but now I see how they're both compatible with each other. And that pushes us, so now we become deeper in our faith, deeper in our understanding. Right? But it takes work to do that. So these mutashabihat that he has in the Quran are a kind of test. So again, like the whole idea, he himself says, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. And he's the one who sent this book down to you. Some of the verses in that book are muhkam, very clear in their meaning, unequivocal. Allahu ahad. There's you can't twist that around and say, well, maybe he's three. And it's clear, that's very, very clear. There's no two ways about, Allahu ahad. Right? But then there are verses that are mutashabihat that he's also put that there. And again, he has the power to make all the verses muhkam. He didn't have to, it wasn't that his hands were tied or he couldn't think of the words or something like that he was unable, and then he had to put some verses that were kind of unclear. They made it past the editor when they shouldn't have, and they kind of went to press too early. It's not like that. So if there are mutashabih verses in the Quran, it's by Allah's design. Why? What's the continuation of the verse? وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٍ فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ ابْتِغَاءَ الْفِتْنَةِ وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ. Right? Those people who have crookedness in their heart, right? If I am already skewed in my thinking, I am, for instance, thinking about my own self-interest, or I'm tied to some idea of my own, and I don't want to give that up. Now when I come to the Quran, those mutashabih verses that are plastic, that are equivocal, that could go this way, could go that way, there are multiple meanings that are possible in those verses. Now I, with my crooked lens and my crooked heart, I look at those and I get out of them what I want. I'm not struggling to try to see what is Allah who wrote the verses trying to say. I'm saying, well, there are three meanings. Out of the three, this one, the third one suits my needs or my interests or my understanding better. So that must be what it means. Like, on what basis? You're not taking into account the fact that third meaning goes against these muhkamat in the Quran. Those solid verses that are unequivocal, you've abandoned those and you've latched on to this mutashabih verse, and you've only taken the meaning that suits your need. Like cherry picking is the term that we use. I've cherry picked one little verse, one little meaning, and I've latched onto that, abandoning the muhkamat, which tell us what those anchors are. The muhkamat are those anchors that keep us grounded in what's right. An honest approach to the Quran would first be to tackle those muhkamat, understand those become the anchors, and then in light of those, making sure all of those, I'm always on kind of solidly attached to those anchors, then I venture into mutashabihat territory. And so every mutashabih verse that I come across, I make sure that I understand it in a way that I don't have to abandon any of those anchors that are solid and unequivocal. So one of the muhkamat that's very commonly cited in a hadith that is really one of those cores is لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. A simple phrase from Surah Ash-Shura, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, there's nothing like him. Right? So now any other verse, when you come across a verse that says, for instance, ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْعَرْشِ, Allah created the heavens and the earth, and then He sat on His throne. Right? So from that verse, you could understand that to be a throne, and He's going and He's sitting on top of that throne because now He's done with the act of creation. But that image means that there's some physical presence to Him. He has a body, He's sitting on a physical throne, He's on top of the throne, not below the throne, He's there and not here. there are all these problems with thinking of God sitting on a physical throne. That can't be the meaning of this verse, because if you accept that meaning, then you have to give up laysa kamithlihi shay. There's nothing like him. He's unlike anything. Because now I'm thinking, no, he's sitting on a chair, he's like me sitting on a chair. The way I'm standing and I sit down on the chair, so God's also, for instance, God's standing and he has to sit down on the chair. Right? He's on top of the chair, not below the chair, not everywhere else. Right? So that kind of a understanding of ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْعَرْشِ, that then he sat on his throne, means that I have to give up the muhkam, the solid verse, the anchor. That's a wrong move. I need to keep a firm grasp on the anchor and understand this verse and say, well, obviously it can't be a literal meaning that there is actually a physical throne and he's sitting on a physical throne. Maybe there's a metaphorical meaning. What does it mean when a king, for instance, finally comes to power and now he sits on his throne? That means he now takes charge. So once God creates everything, then he took up the position of now managing all of this. This is his dominion, his kingdom. So now he's taking on the task of managing all of this as Rabb. And the image of a throne and a king sitting on a throne is just a metaphor, so that we can understand that when the king, or a president after inauguration, for instance, moves into the East Wing, moves into the residence of the White House. Right? So now he's officially kind of president. Once the judge sits at the bench, that bench and the gavel and those kinds of things are symbols of him now presiding over the courtroom. So those are the images that we understand. Allah uses that image to help us to understand His dominion, His ruling over His kingdom, like your kings who sit on their thrones and then they're in power over their dominion. Right? That interpretation is compatible with the muhkam, which is laysa kamithlihi shay. There's nothing like God. God is like nothing. Because I haven't compared Him to anything, that He is actually like that. We're taking away all those limitations of physical space and being on top and not below and these kinds of things. We're throwing all those things out and understanding God's power and His managing of the dominion in a way that is free of all of those problematic concepts. All right. Recite one salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So we've understood something about why we believe that the prophets must be infallible rationally. We've also understood some answers to why Allah would choose to write verses into the Quran that are mutashabih, that are equivocal, that seem to hint at sins of prophets. So now, the other question is, how do we understand these verses? One by one, we have to go through and see when it says that, for instance, Adam disobeyed his Lord, and because of that disobedience became ghawi and misguided. Like, how can that be compatible with his infallibility? Right, I won't get into the details of each of those questions, because that itself would require a whole lecture. But that's the kind of the struggle that we have to go through as we look through these verses. But we have the anchor of infallibility, which it's not a muhkam verse, but it's a muhkam idea. It's a rational idea. And that itself is now going to help us, and it's going to be the lens with which we look at these verses. These mutashabih verses, then we interpret them in a way that we can keep that rational concept that the prophets are infallible as we look at each of these verses. When we come to a verse like this from Surah At-Tawbah, Afallahu anka, this is one of those verses that commentators from Ahlul Sunnah jump on and say, this proves that the Prophet is capable of sin. Otherwise, why would Allah say, Afallahu ank, may God forgive you? Why would He scold him and say, Lima adhinta lahum, why did you give them permission? You shouldn't have. Right? This is one of those verses. Another verse that they put a finger on is the one from Surah Al-Anfal, where Allah says, ما كان لنبي أن يكون له أسرى حتى يثخن في الأرض تريدون عرض الدنيا والله يريد الآخرة والله عزيز حكيم. So Surah Al-Anfal takes place, or it's revealed after the Battle of Badr. And one of the things that happened in the Battle of Badr was that the Muslims started to take captives. They weren't supposed to. The point of Badr was to wipe out the Quraysh. I talked about it in, I think, one of the lectures or majlis, that the whole point, Allah brought the two armies together with some illusions as well, making the Muslims and the mushrikeen see things different ways to get them onto the battlefield, get them to fight. So no one would flee, no one would run away. He wanted the Muslims to fight these Quraysh because he wanted to, this was their opportunity now to get rid of all these hard-hearted, hopeless, spiritually dead leaders of the Quraysh. There was no hope left for them. Rasulullah had done everything he could to try to guide them in the 13 years while he was in Mecca. And these are the people who continued to make fun of him, who would throw garbage on his head, who would take the entrails of camels and dump it on him, and all these sorts of things, put thorns in his path. So this was their response to his guidance and his goodwill and his compassion, all of that. If he couldn't get through to them, there was no hope left for them. And so now the only thing left was to get rid of them. And this was the way, it's the Battle of Badr. And so as the battle, as they engaged in the battle, people like Amir al-Mu'mineen, people like Hamza, Sayyid al-Shuhada, they did what they were supposed to do. They didn't take a single prisoner. Everyone they met, they killed. So at least half of all of the ones killed at Badr were killed by Amir al-Mu'mineen. Out of 313, one person killed half of the Qurashi casualties, and then all the other 312 killed the other half. And he took no prisoners. Because that wasn't his mandate. That's not what Rasulullah wanted. He wanted them to kill everyone. There were some, so as the battle takes place, then the mushrikeen turn around, they start running, and the Muslims, they were following their Jahili traditions, the Jahili culture. You chase down your enemy, you capture them, they become your prisoners, you negotiate with their family members, and you get a ransom. So it's part of your spoils of war is not only what's on the battlefield, the weapons and the animals and those things on the battlefield. Now it's also these assets that you're now capturing and ransoming off to their people. Look, I have your elder, I want this much money for him. If you give the money by this date, then you can have him back. I'll release him. That's what the Muslims wanted to do, the majority of the Muslims. And so they run off and they start capturing these prisoners. Rasulullah didn't want them to do this. He told them, what are you doing? So he singles out certain ones of them and tells Imam Ali to go and kill them. As they're prisoners already, it's called qatl sabran. They're bound and he kills them. Right? Because they deserved it, because this is what they needed to be executed. Finally, this verse comes down scolding the Prophet, saying, "Ma kana li nabiyyin an yakuna lahu asra." It was not ever written for a prophet to take prisoners, hatta yuthkhina fil ard, until he was well established. You're not in a position yet, you can't, just think of the dynamics. If I now let all these leaders of Quraysh from Badr go back to Mecca, they're just going to keep doing what they have been doing. They're going to reorganize, they're going to launch a bigger campaign, and next time they're going to take casualties worse than they did today. They kill 6 or 7 people or 11 people today, they're going to kill more in the next year. You're not in a position where you can be that generous to let your enemies, especially the worst of the enemies, live off the battlefield. So this was never for prophets to capture prisoners until they were so well established that they could be generous and let that person go back and not fear that they're going to face a reprisal from the person the coming year, the next battle. So it sounds, the beginning of the verse sounds like Allah scolding the Prophet. Why did you do this? And prophets were never allowed to do this before. But then the continuation of the verse tells us who the real problem was. Turiduna in the plural, you plural wanted the fleeting pleasures of the dunya, while Allah wanted for you the akhirah. Okay, why were the Muslims going after the prisoners? Because of their dunyawi interest. They weren't thinking about the Islamic interest, the dini interest, which was that we need to wipe out the enemy to move our mission forward. They were thinking, I can get a lot more money if they're alive. And actually, as the Prophet starts to order their execution, Imam Ali goes to execute them, it raises an uproar. with the companions, why are you doing this? It's perfectly good money, you're spilling it as blood. Right? So the scolding here, it's true that Allah sometimes will address his verse to the Prophet. There's a saying in Arabic that's always used by our scholars, it's from a Jahili story, but the phrase is Iyaki a'ni wasma'i ya jara. Right? Sometimes you want someone else to hear something, but you, for whatever reason, can't tell them directly, so you pick someone else to tell it to, hoping that person will listen. An example, for instance, say your child has a friend over, and the friend is doing something wrong, but you scold your child, because you can scold your child, and you want the friend to hear. Maybe your child's not doing anything, but you have the relationship, you can tell him, don't do that. And the friend hears and understands that, he should not be doing it, but you never had to tell the friend directly because you told your kid. That's a very wise kind of tactic to use. Sometimes you can say things in a roundabout way that's more effective than saying it directly. So this is the tactic that Allah time and again uses in the Quran. He will address sometimes his scolding to the Prophet and say, if you do shirk, then Allah will sever your jugular vein, to the Prophet. The Prophet, he was never mushrik even before he was a Prophet. He's not tempted. Shirk is not something tempting and beautiful that he's tempted to do it. But Allah scolds him in this really gruesome kind of, very gory type of a way. Why? Because he wants the rest of the people to understand that this is something you have to stay away from. But he uses the Prophet as they're on the same team. He can scold the Prophet and everyone else has to understand. So here, it wasn't the Prophet's policy. He was not the one who wanted them to take prisoners. He wanted them just the opposite, to kill everyone. He told them that. Some of his righteous companions followed his instructions, many of them did not. So now Allah speaks in a way that, partly seems like it's scolding the Prophet. Prophets never did this in the past, why are you doing this? But then the pronoun changes, turiduna, you plural. It's not turidu, which is singular to you, the Prophet. Turiduna arad al-dunya, wallahu yuridu al-akhirah. You plural Muslims want temporary pleasures of the world, while Allah wants for you what's in the hereafter. The puzzle is that commentators from Ahlul Sunnah have absolutely no problem taking these two verses and saying that these indicate that the Prophet himself committed sin. And it almost seems like they take relish in talking about the Prophet's sin. Let's see, this is the words, Zamakhshari is a Mu'tazili commentator of Quran. He has Al-Kashaf, an amazing tafsir, a kind of a groundbreaking tafsir that opened the doors for generations after. So amazing in many ways. But when it comes to this verse, Afa Allahu ank, he says this indicates that the Prophet committed a jinaya, a crime. Right? And he takes such relish in it. Allama Tabatabai, when he talks about this, and he never takes anyone's names directly. When he's criticizing another commentator, he won't say so and so said something. He'll say it has been said, and then he'll talk about the idea or even the person. Here he breaks character. He still doesn't mention the name of Zamakhshari, but he says that it seems that Zamakhshari should have sat down with this sinful prophet and taken a lesson from God. Because God himself, even if you say that this verse is scolding the Prophet, how does Allah scold the Prophet? Very tactful. Afa Allahu an. First he says, may Allah forgive you. Very gently makes a prayer, may Allah forgive you. And then he asks a question, Lima adhinta lahum, why did you give them permission? Not saying you did this and you did that, but it's a rhetorical question. So Allah, even if he's talking about a sin of the Prophet and this and that, he was very tactful, and he was teaching us and teaching his Prophet good akhlaq. But apparently Zamakhshari lost the lesson. He said Zamakhshari should sit down with the sinful Prophet so he can learn some adab and akhlaq from Allah. So this is a challenge that we have. Like when it comes to, for instance, Abasa wa Tawalla, this is another verse, another surah that has the same kinds of discussion. عبس وتولى أن جاءه الأعمى وما يدريك لعله يزكى أو يذكر فتنفعه الذكرى, and so forth. So this person, some person frowned and turned away when a person came to ask him a question. Sunni commentators have absolutely no problem saying that even though it's talking in the third person, he frowned and turned away. An ja'ahu al-a'ma, because this blind person came to him. They have no problem saying that's Rasulullah that's being scolded here. He's the one who frowned and turned away. Then some Shi'i commentators, there's one weak tradition that's not acceptable, but there's one weak tradition that says that it was someone from the Umayyads. It wasn't Rasulullah, it was an Umayyad, indicating probably it's Uthman. Right? There, if you say that and to a Sunni, they'll go up in arms. How dare you say something so bad about Uthman? That irony is very telling. Like, why are you not offended to attribute something like to Rasulullah, and you actually take relish in saying, look, see, Rasulullah, he made this mistake and God's scolding him. But if we attribute it to some companion, whether Uthman or any companion, one of the companions must have done it because it's the third person, it's not Rasulullah, it goes against his character, it goes, there's so many reasons not to put it to Rasulullah, but if you attribute it to any of the companions, then how dare you? That is, I think, very telling. That reveals a nifaq within a person who's willing to think like that, to attribute the worst things to the Prophet, but has this loyalty to his companions. All right. So with that background, inshallah, tomorrow we'll look more at this verse, Afallahu anka, and the following verses about this. What permission are they asking for? What permission did Rasulullah give? Why did he give it? Is he being scolded, or no? Or he and Allah kind of doing role playing to communicate some message to the rest of the people through this going back and forth with a apparent scolding of Rasulullah. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Help us, Allah, to have the tawfiq and the inspiration and the energy to struggle with your revelation. Guide us to find the correct meaning. Help us to use our intellect. Help us to be firm in our attachment to the muhkamat of the Quran, and let us be amongst those who have no crookedness in their heart, and to find the true meaning of the mutashabihat. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alayka ya Rasulullah. Assalamu ala al-a'immat al-hadin al-mahdiyyin. السلام على جميع أنبياء الله ورسله وملائكته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.